will share his insights into DC's current economic and policy trends. He'll highlight what we know about key issues such as housing, affordability, and the racial wealth gap. And he will discuss some of the leading progressive advocacy campaigns from universal childcare to decriminalizing sex work. Ed served for 2 decades as executive director of the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, 2001 to 2020, where he led research on inequalities in housing, jobs, education, and healthcare. He partnered with advocates and residents to address these issues. Ed contributed to creating the DC Earned Income Tax Credit, closing corporate tax loopholes, raising income taxes on DC's wealthiest residents, and reforming DC's school funding formula to steer more resources to high-poverty schools. Ed ran for DC Council in 2008 and 2020 and remains engaged in DC policy and political campaigns. He and his wife, Suzanne Griffith, have been members of Temple Micah for almost 25 years, and their sons were bar mitzvahed here. So I welcome Ed, and we will come back after Ed's finished his presentation. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so nice to be here in person, and I know you all are excited to be back. So I'm really, as I was saying to somebody, like, it doesn't really matter what I say. We're all back together in person, so we're all going to have fun, right? So yes, and this July is when my wife and I joined the 25-year club, and we know that because we joined when our second son was born, and his 25th birthday is July 28th. So I'm excited for that as well. Is there is there speeches you do when you're part of the 25-year club? Oh, absolutely. Is that better?
Much.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that. Okay, so I'm really happy to be here. When I volunteered to do this, which was last fall, it's like, well, let's just talk about something related to DC. And I'm like, okay, we'll figure that out. And little did I know that when this day approached, that we would be in the middle of a really exciting, competitive political cycle in the district with the primary coming up. We all knew that was going to happen. But the fact that we have incredibly competitive races here in Ward 3 and in Ward 5, maybe in Ward 1, an attorney general seat where that is open, competitive mayor's race, like it's really a lot happening and a lot of issues are being discussed. And that's really what I want to spend my time talking about today, of what this election could mean, depending on the outcome in terms of the ability to advance some really important issues in the District of Columbia. And I'll focus on some advocacy campaigns that I'm aware of through my work, what they're calling for, and the factors behind that. I will, just to be clear, I'm going to present what those advocacy campaigns are looking for. They're generally things I support as well. So I'll be sort of taking a side on issues. I understand that there may be people in the room who disagree on some or all of those issues. And I encourage you to, when it comes to the Q&A, to probe me with questions about those issues, but also to talk about other issues that might be happening that are on your mind as well. I'm not going to talk about candidates specifically because that would be sort of awkward and inappropriate. I'm happy offline to talk to you about any races and my thoughts on some of those if you'd like, but I won't be talking about any specific campaigns or any specific candidates. I'll just talk about the issues. And I will say I've devoted most of my career to focusing on issues of economic and racial inequality in DC, and it's really been an amazing blessing for me. Not surprisingly, really rewarding to be able to do work in my own community, see the fruits of my labor, be able to watch benefits and programs get passed, and then know that people are taking advantage of them. I greatly see the importance and role of federal policy. For example, really frustrated that we can't get the Build Back Better package through Congress and all of the things that it would do, including the child tax credit, which for a short period of time reduced child poverty in this country by 40% and is now going away. But for me personally, the rubber really hits the road when it's local, particularly at the city level. When you can really.
Second, Sid, the camera is only picturing you, not the speaker.
The camera's on Sid?
Yeah.
Interesting.
No. Not my camera. I see you, Ed.
I saw you. Now it just went to Kid Wheatley,
good?
No,
but it was, now I see you.
If everybody on Zoom please mutes themselves, then it will only show Ed.
I'm looking at it. Okay. This is what people at home are saying.
I was just gonna fix it.
Yeah, okay. Okay,
We're good?
and everybody at home, put it on speaker view, please.
All right, so what I was saying is, for me, the local issues are really important, because when you think about some of the thornier issues of inequality, like what we'll talk about in a minute, homeless, tent encampments, or reforming policing to be more racially just, those are really local issues, and they require local decision-making. I also really like working on issues in the District of Columbia, because we are, in essence, a state. We will, and someday will be a state, is my hope and plan. But we are able to make decisions in a community that is largely democratic, largely progressive, and unlike many states, or most states, where there are 2 chambers, hundreds of people in the legislature, we have a 13-member DC council. So if you could persuade 7 people to do something, you can get really big things done in the District of Columbia. So that's why we have, for example, a $15 minimum wage. We have nearly universal healthcare coverage in the city. We have a really generous and progressive paid family and medical leave program that most states don't have at all. So really amazing things are possible. And I would just sort of reiterate that while a lot of the times when we talk about the district, we think about Congress and the heavy hand of Congress and it weighing in on local decisions and ultimately having the say on policy in the DC. All that is true. And we obviously do not have a vote in Congress, which is a shame. But in terms of actually managing our day-to-day affairs, we as DC residents who we vote for, and then our policymakers, have a lot of power to do things that will affect all of our lives and potentially create a more equitable city. So that's why I have always loved doing DC work. And I would also start, before jumping into the policy issues, just want to talk a little bit about the fact that DC historically has been known as Chocolate City. And it's not Chocolate City anymore because it's not a majority Black city. At one point we were 70 or 80% Black, and now it's closer to 45%, but still the largest group in the city is Black. Every mayor we've had since Home Rule in 1973 has been Black. And yet we have the same economic and racial inequities and challenges that any state or any city has across the country, whether you're looking at affordable housing or healthcare, particularly maternal healthcare, income, wealth. We have enormous gaps. And
the camera's not on you again.
David, are we okay?
It's fine.
It's
fine.
okay. It's
Yeah.
what we
Yeah,
see.
don't look at that.
We see.
David Diskin will tell us if there's a problem. So for me, it's a reminder, well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that even though it has been a majority Black city and has had Black leadership, that's only been 50 years. And we have the same history of racism and racist policy that every community across the country has had. And there are long-lasting impacts to those policies. They're not easy to undo. And I say that because, number one, it's a reminder that when we talk about being anti-racist, that's what it means, right? Not just avoid being racist, but to be anti-racist means to proactively take steps to undo the impacts of racism and all of the inequities that they have created. And that's why the elections matter to me, the people we elect matter to me, and why these issues are important to me. So let me just give you some facts that sort of highlight the state of the District of Columbia and those inequities that I'm so concerned about. So we know that redlining and restrictive covenants and a federal government that wouldn't make home loans to Black people was the same here as in every other community. We know that Black communities have been displaced not too far from here in Fort Reno, also around the Capitol. And those have led to tremendous economic and racial gaps. So we know, for example, that the average wealth of Black residents in this region is $3,500. $3,500 compared to nearly $300,000 for white households, a gap of 81 to 1. The average wealth of white households in this region is 81 times the average wealth of Black households. And Black household wealth is almost nothing. And much of that relates to the denial of opportunities to own homes that Black families face. The income gap is similarly wide. The typical Black household in DC has an income of less than $50,000 compared to almost $150,000 for white households. Beyond that, we know that half of the subsidized housing in the district is in Ward 7 and Ward 8, and that is consciously placed there, right? So we made a decision as a community that we were going to segregate low-income people of color by putting most of our low-income housing and subsidized housing in the poorest parts of town. We also know that historically Black people have been relegated to low-skill and low-paid jobs, such as domestic work and laborers. It's not just, while DC was the first place where people who were enslaved were emancipated, there were Black codes and tremendous occupational restrictions that kept Black people in low-skill and low-paid jobs. Not recent as, but in 1900, which was 40 years after enslaved people were freed in the District of Columbia, 90% of Black women who were employed were domestics. And that wasn't because that was their choice, it was because those were the only jobs that were available to them. And so when we see today, the majority of Black residents being in service level jobs and low wage jobs, and the majority of white residents in managerial and higher paid jobs, that's not an accident. That is a reflection of our history and the policies that brought us to where we are today. We also know that schools in DC currently are segregated, reflecting a long history of segregation in this country. Many of you know, maybe some of you know, that Brown versus Board of Education was a suit that was a number of school systems, including the District of Columbia. That DC schools were segregated in the 1950s as they were in most parts of the country. That's why in a lot of neighborhoods, there are actually public schools that are very close to each other because one was a white school and one was a Black school. And we see that segregation hasn't ended, that almost half of DC schools currently are 90% Black. Most Black and brown students are in schools where a majority of the kids are Black and brown, while most white students are in schools that are a minority, a small share are Black and brown and are generally low poverty schools. And maybe I'll just wrap it up there and get into the policy issues, because yes, this is all depressing, but this is why we need to do the work that we need to do to elect good people who are going to tackle these challenges. So I want to talk to you about homelessness, affordable housing, policing, Initiative 82, which would raise wages for tip workers, schools, and childcare. Those are the things I'm going to talk about, and of course, open to taking questions on any other issues that you care about. And all of these are active campaigns being led by some organization, or it's often coalitions. I did provide, and I think it's maybe on the table back there, a list of resources to learn more about these issues. They're right here. Yeah. The number one thing that I would recommend is reading the book Chocolate City. Can I see show of hands if you know the book Chocolate City? Yeah, it's a recent book, came out in the last 5 years or so by local historians, and it's a history of race and democracy in the District of Columbia, going back to the creation of the district in the 1790s. So let's talk about issues. First, we'll talk about homelessness. And the good news is actually the district is making a lot of progress to end homelessness. And that might not be so evident to folks who drove here today and saw. Is that my computer making noise? There's nothing you can do about it. It'll go off in a minute. Sorry about that. I mean, even on my drive from my office here today, when I passed by DuPont Circle, there were tents, you know, on the DuPont Circle overway. We see those everywhere around the city. But the good news is actually we're making a difference, that the city has invested a lot in something known as permanent supportive housing, which provides permanent affordable housing to people who face chronic homelessness, meaning they've been homeless for a long time and often have a substance abuse or mental health problem, puts them into their own housing, and then provides wraparound services to support their recovery as well. And the amazing news about permanent supportive housing is just how effective it is. By putting people into housing and creating that stability, most people who are chronically homeless start to put their lives back together. They're better able to manage their mental health problems. They're better able to handle substance abuse disorder because they have a home base. And we've helped thousands of people move from their home, from the street into their own homes. Particularly over this past year, when the DC Council adopted a tax increase focused almost entirely on millionaires and created enough housing for nearly 2,000 people to move from homelessness into their own home. The reality, of course, is that it's not enough, right? And as I said, we still see, and it's very visible, the tent encampments across the city. So I wanted to talk a little bit about those, because those have also been controversial. As you probably know, Mayor Bowser has taken a pretty active step in the past few years to quote unquote clear encampments, remove people from encampments. She has at times mixed that with offerings of affordable housing to people who are in the tent encampments. But the people who advocate around homelessness in the city oppose what the mayor has done and are opposed to the aggressive approach to closing tent encampments. And the primary concern is that people are being removed forcibly from the only home they have without necessarily a guarantee of housing, that not everybody in an encampment has been offered housing. Not everybody, by the time the encampments are cleared, has a next place to go. And what the advocates would much rather see is the city aggressively work to create more affordable housing, work directly with people who are in encampments to find a housing alternative. And at that point, you eliminate tent encampments by simply helping people into housing rather than forcibly closing encampments where people lose their tent. They often lose personal, IDs and other important possessions. And I'm on that side as well. The legislation, there was an effort in the council to stop the mayor's tent encampment process this past year, but that failed. And so really, we are now in a situation where the only real solution to addressing homelessness is to invest a lot more in affordable housing. And that is what the housing advocates say, or homeless advocates say, that we end homelessness through affordable housing, which of course, in some ways is common sense. So let's talk a minute about the city's affordable housing situation as well. And let me look at my notes. Oh, I guess you may have in your mind, certainly I have in my mind, how could it be the case that the city is investing a lot to end homelessness, and yet we are seeing more, what seems to be more and more tent encampments? I don't actually have a great answer for you, but what we generally know is the people who are in tent encampments are there because they either really don't like the shelters, they don't feel they're safe, that their things are safe, or their physical safety is being protected. They may be in a relationship and they are not allowed to go into a shelter with their partner. They may have a pet and not be allowed to take their pet into shelter, or they may just be fearful that the shelter conditions, I said, are either unsanitary or unsafe. And there are also, of course, people who are just choosing to be on the street for a variety of reasons, including a number of people who have a mental illness and are just avoiding people generally. So let's talk about affordable housing as well. And the short story there is that regardless of where you live in the country, but particularly in the District of Columbia, we have an economy that just does not work to put people into affordable housing, where we have really low wages and a lot of low wage jobs, or low public benefits and really high housing costs. So in the District of Columbia and across the nation, if you're low income, it's almost guaranteed, and you're not in subsidized housing, it's almost guaranteed that you'll be spending more than half of your income, and often close to 100% of your income every month, just to stay in your apartment. And usually what that means is your housing is precarious. You might be choosing to live with someone you'd rather not live with. You may be in an unsafe situation. You're not sure how you're going to pay your bills. Your refrigerator is likely to be empty, and your children are not likely to be well fed. You're likely to live in a neighborhood that you would rather not live in. But that is the reality. And unfortunately, our federal housing policy has failed to provide affordable housing, unlike some programs like food assistance, the SNAP program, where if you're low income, you're automatically eligible. Our federal programs have never worked that way. And across the country, only 1 out of 4 people who qualify for federal housing assistance actually get it. So the vast, vast majority of people who are living on low incomes, low wage part-time jobs, or public benefit programs that don't offer very much have to deal with the private market. And that means they're facing that stress all the time. And it just creates enormous trauma for themselves. It has harmful impacts on children as well, in terms of their stability, their ability to succeed in school. And this is another area where the city has made progress to the extent you follow what happens in local politics. We've invested a lot in something known as the Housing Production Trust Fund, which helps build affordable housing. And it is making progress. It's just not enough, and it's not always reaching the right people. Because one of the issues that we see in affordable housing in the district is that the definition of affordable is a little bit loose and a little bit squishy. Because affordability in housing programs is tied to area incomes, and a lot of programs are targeted at at a level that's equal to 80% of the area median income. And if median income is the midpoint, 80% of median sounds like, well, that's got to be relatively low. We have a really high median income in the District of Columbia and in the region. So 80% of the area median income is $100,000 for a family of 4. That's double the median income for Black households, period. So it's clearly not reaching the poorest families when we have housing programs, when the mayor or the council says, hey, we've created affordable housing. You have to take a step further and say, well, what is affordable? How are you defining affordable? Who is it really targeting? And we've done a really good job of building affordable housing for that moderate income set. What we haven't done enough of is invest in affordable housing for the lowest income families. And the best way to do that is through a program known as housing vouchers, where you basically tell people, you go find an apartment, you pay 30% of your income for rent, and through the voucher, we'll cover the rest. And that guarantees that housing doesn't take up any more than 30% of income for any low-income family. And that's the part of our affordable housing toolkit that the city has used the least. And that's why we continue to see homelessness on the rise, why we continue to see tent encampments, why we continue to see so many families paying most of their income for rent. So when we think about what we want our next policymakers to do, what this election could mean, certainly investing more in the housing programs that reach the poorest families through our vouchers is critical. Another issue is investing in public housing. Public housing is funded by the federal government, which has also walked away from that obligation. And so public housing across the country, but particularly in DC, is often in a really awful physical state and requiring people to live in incredibly inhumane conditions. The current Public Housing Authority backlog of needs is almost $2 billion of repair needs. And that's $2 billion of people really living in awful conditions because we haven't invested in their housing. And because the federal government has advocated what advocates have asked for in the district is we just need to fund this locally. We want people to live in decent housing, including public housing. So we should pay for that. And that's continues to be a major issue in the city. The public housing doesn't cover anywhere near the need. We also have a housing authority wait list that has been closed for almost 10 years with 30,000 households on it. So public housing continues to be a big issue and will continue to be an issue for our next set of elected officials. Another big issue that is being discussed in campaigns is rent control. So the city has rent control, and that's a good thing. It sort of limits how much landlords can raise rents from year to year. There's actually a lot of rent control properties here in Ward 3. Yes, we have some people in the room who benefit from rent control. It creates housing stability, the same kind of housing stability that I have because I own my house and my mortgage is the same from month to month to month to month to month, right? But if you're a renter, you don't have that stability without rent control. The problem is, and there are actually many problems, but the main problem with rent control is that it was passed in 1978. And the political compromise at that time was to say, well, we'll only cover buildings built through 1975. Well, guess what today is what rent control covers? Buildings built before 1975. So it's a 50-year-old program, and any housing that's been built in the last 45 years, which includes most of the housing that you see around you, is not covered at all by rent control. Landlords are able to charge whatever they want and to raise rents by whatever amount they want from year to year. There also are tremendous loopholes even for existing rent controlled properties, in particular ones where landlords sort of bribe the current tenants to say, hey, we won't raise your rent at all for as long as you live here, as long as we can raise the rent as much as we want to for future tenants. Will you vote for that? And it of course puts a lot of tenants in a bind because their personal financial interest is at stake. So it's called voluntary agreements. It's a tremendous loophole that needs to be closed. So there's a campaign in the city called Reclaim Rent Control, and their goal is to have rent control cover any building once it reaches 15 years old. So at this point, it would cover buildings from 2007 and in the past. It would limit rent increases to no more than inflation from year to year. It would close that voluntary agreement loophole and create a number of other protections as well. Legislation has been introduced to pass rent control, but it hasn't gone anywhere in the district to date. And then the final big issue that's here and also everywhere is evictions. We know that in the pandemic, so many people lost their jobs and their ability to pay rent. So many people got behind on their rent. Fortunately, the federal relief packages included hundreds of millions of dollars, $350 million in DC, to help people who are behind on rent. And that has kept the evictions at least temporarily from spiking. The problem is that money's now gone. It's completely been spent. And the district's own pot of money, what it allocates every year for emergency rental assistance, well, compared to that $350 million is more like $20 million. So it's just a tremendous the inadequate program to help people who are going back to the same system where they have low-wage jobs and high rents, often in buildings that aren't rent controlled. So another big issue that needs to be addressed is, what do we do to stop that trauma of evictions, which we know creates a downward spiral for families, contributes to homelessness, obviously isn't good for the people immediately affected, but also isn't good for the city as a whole. So those are sort of where we are in housing issues. I probably will just keep talking and then take questions. I probably am throwing a lot at you, but if there's any clarified questions as we go along, people should also feel free to raise their hands. So, but if not, let's talk about the really controversial issue of policing, which is a big issue in this debate, in this campaign season. And for me, the questions are, what causes violence, what reduces it, and what are the harms that come with policing, and how do we balance all of those to create more safety, to create real safety, to address why we have a lack of safety, and to address the fact that policing is inherently harmful, particularly to Black and brown people. I think it's important to note that DC has more police per capita than almost any large city in the country. In fact, it's about, the number of police per capita here is about twice the national average. So to the extent that there are some who are saying we should have more police, it's just important to remember that the current policing is already quite high, and it hasn't, the problems that we have, the problems that we're all concerned about, are happening in the context of our current policing system. We also know that policing here, as it is everywhere in the country, is rooted in a history of racism, that policing actually started in this country out of fugitive slave patrols, and then Black codes policies that were intended to keep Black people out of cities, and in many ways just to control the lives of Black residents. And we see that today, where it's, whether it's what they call it jump outs in the District of Columbia, or stop and frisk in New York, or the fact that marijuana use is equal by race, and yet nearly everyone who's arrested or was arrested before marijuana was decriminalized, nearly everyone arrested for a marijuana offense in the District of Columbia was Black. That there's racism in our policing. We don't need to talk about the murder of George Floyd and other police brutality to know that policing is inherently problematic. So the question is, how do we move forward? And certainly the campaigns are talking about what do we do to reform policing, but also what do we do to create alternatives to policing? And what I would point you to, and the thing that I think is really important, is a commission report that came out, I believe in 2020, maybe in 2021, from a police reform commission in the district. It was all local people. And the things that they talked about as alternatives to policing, the report was called Decentering Police to Create a Safer District of Columbia, something along those lines. So number one, the goal is to respond with non-police personnel to many cases when police are not used. So if there's a mental health crisis, someone's having a mental health crisis, rather than have a police officer intervene who may not be trained, and certainly not a mental health professional, to send a mobile mental health crisis unit. To have police involved in traffic stops often results in escalation and violence and harm. So having non-police staff involved in traffic safety control is another example. Those are some of the main ways that people are talking about shifting responsibilities that police themselves say they don't want to do into other staff, who are unarmed and therefore less likely to create harm. So that's one policy. Just let's shift as much as we can that the police don't need to do other than responding to the most violent incidents to, in fact, other staff who are better trained and less likely to cause harm. A second recommendation of the Police Reform Commission is to strengthen our safety net, the recognition that the root causes of violence are community and family instability, people who don't have the resources themselves to meet their needs, and that a stronger safety net through mental health services, through greater public income and support and food assistance and housing assistance, that those are the keys to creating stable families, to creating stable communities, and ultimately to reducing violence. And all of the candidates who are running for Attorney General in the district, which is another competitive race, have said that that's their main goal, is to address the root causes of violence. A third recommendation is to decriminalize low-level offenses. So I learned in the last year or two that in Columbia Heights, there are a lot of immigrants who cook and sell food on the street. And they often do that without having the proper food permits. And that's not right. They shouldn't be doing that. But rather than having someone from the DC Consumer and Regulatory Affairs agency come to them and say, hey, you're doing this illegally, you need to get a permit, here's how you do it, they're often arrested by the police, criminalized for just trying to make money for their families. So one of the recommendations is to say situations like that, we may not want people to do illegal vending, but we don't need to arrest people who are just trying to support their families. So let's decriminalize vending, for example. Another really hot issue is whether to decriminalize sex work. And some people equate that with legalizing prostitution, and that's not, they're really very different things. So right now, sex work, there are, of course, sex workers here as there are everywhere, and it's criminal. And because it is a criminal offense, people who are sex workers are often victimized by the police themselves, or they're engaged in underground black market activity. Whatever their sex work has to happen in a hidden way, in a way that is less safe. So the advocates for sex workers themselves, primarily an organization known as HIPS, they want sex work to be decriminalized, meaning that whether you're the buyer or the seller in this situation, that you cannot be, you can be cited, perhaps it would not necessarily be completely legalized, but decriminalized, meaning that people couldn't be arrested or go to jail for sex work, knowing that in many cases, the people who are engaging in sex work are engaging in that because that's the only way they feel like they can raise the money that they need to survive. Similarly related to that is the Police Reform Commission recommends that a lot of low-level offenses where people currently are arrested should instead be replaced with citations, tickets, rather than going to jail. Getting police out of schools, which the DC Council voted for a year ago. The mayor tried to put the police back in the schools this spring, but the council once again voted to get police out of schools, replacing them with more mental health professionals rather than police officers. Another recommendation, maybe I'm going on too long, is to invest more in community-based violence prevention. There are people who are staffed in the districts. It's a relatively new concept called violence interrupters. These are community-based people who understand the community, who are not police officers themselves, who understand the nature of the kind of conflicts that happen in communities, and they work to mediate those conflicts and address them before violence occurs and without having to get the police involved. And maybe I will wrap that up there because I feel like I'm talking a little too long. So I will talk just about a few more issues. One is Initiative 82. That's going to be on the ballot in November. It's similar to the initiative that was passed in 2018, Initiative 77, to raise wages for tip workers. So if you're a tipped worker in the district, which includes restaurant servers and bartenders, it also includes people who work in restaurants as bussers or bar supporters, bar backs they call them, and make $5 an hour plus tips. And in a lot of restaurants and a lot of places that work on tips are enough to make a decent living. But you can sort of imagine if your base pay is $5 an hour plus tips, if the weather is cold or rainy, if you're you work in a place that doesn't necessarily have high prices or isn't the most popular place, it could be a restaurant that's going out of business and there are no customers, that your income is likely to be highly unstable and often low. And that is what the research shows. People who rely primarily on tips, who tend to be women of color, have much higher rates of poverty, much higher rates of public assistance use than other workers. They're much more likely to be subject to sexual abuse, because if you're a server and a customer is abusing you, you might have to take that abuse because you need their tip. So what the Initiative 82 would do is to eliminate that minimum wage and say that every server, everyone who's currently getting tips, is paid $15 an hour with tips on top of that. And what we've seen across the country is that there are 7 states that currently operate that way. There is no sub-minimum wage. Everyone gets the full minimum wage, and if you're in a tipped industry, you get tips on top of that. And what we found is that people in those places still get tips. So California is an example where servers earn the full minimum wage of almost $15 an hour, and the tipping rate in California is actually higher than the tipping rate in the District of Columbia. So you'll have a chance to vote on that in November. The opposition says that it will kill the restaurant industry. The fact that there are a number of states, including California, that already operate under that system tells me that we can adapt. And it's important to note that the Initiative 82 wouldn't change the wage for tip workers overnight. It would raise it from $5 an hour to $15 an hour over a period of almost a decade. Maybe I'll wrap up talking about universal childcare. Probably not surprising to you that the research shows that high quality early childhood education, if you work with kids, babies and infants and toddlers, to make sure they're in educationally appropriate settings, it has a huge impact on their success later in life. It just has a huge payoff. Unfortunately, childcare is incredibly expensive. Any of you who have family members who have little kids in childcare know just how incredibly expensive childcare is, even if you have 2 workers in a family and good jobs. And for low-income families, it's especially hard to find high-quality childcare. So people often use informal care that's low quality, that does not provide the benefits that the best kind of childcare can provide. Well, legislation passed several years ago to try to address that, called the Birth to 3 Act. And among the things that it called for was providing high-quality childcare to every low-income child in the district, and making sure that no family in the city paid more than 10% of their income for childcare, regardless of their income. So really trying to make it more affordable for middle-income families as well. The legislation passed, but like a lot of things in DC, it passed, but it wasn't funded. So now the question is whether we will fund it or not. And one of the key issues in the early childhood space is that the people who work in early childhood education centers until recently were among the lowest paid in the district, paid about $15 an hour. And you can imagine it's hard to keep people and hard to find people with advanced skills if all you're paying is $15 an hour. So the district is moving to try to increase the education requirements for people who work in early childhood education, while also working to increase their pay. When the council voted last year to raise taxes on high-income residents, a big chunk of that money actually went to raising pay for early childhood educators. So we are starting to make progress on getting towards high-quality, universally accessible and affordable childcare, but we're not there yet, and that will be a big issue for whoever is elected this primary season. I think I'm going to stop there because I probably threw a lot at you, and also I think I probably have used up my time allotment. There may be other issues on your mind. I'm eager to hear your questions or your comments on the issues that have been raised, as well as other issues that may be of importance to you.
Mike?
All right.
I'm here with a traveling mic, so if you have a question, raise your hand and I will come to you. Right here.
Thank you. My name is Rita Kirstein. I've worked in the field of higher ed, both as a professor, but also studying higher ed, and served on the board of UDC for a number of years. So I'm very interested in hearing what's going on there. They've not been in the news, which is always a good thing for that institution. But I do believe that the district needs good higher education institutions that are affordable. So you can bring me up to date.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Where to start? So I think the unfortunate situation is that UDC simply doesn't get the attention that it needs. There isn't a single champion either in the mayor's office or the council right now. So it continues to be funded at sort of its current inadequate level from year to year, and it's able to maintain quality in some of the programs. It has a particularly strong law school, for example. But beyond that, it has not drawn the support that it needs. So it creates an enormous challenge in that a number of families who would love to send their kids locally to a public school are not able to do that. The Congress still provides the tuition assistance program that gives people $10,000 per year if their children go to public schools outside of the district. But of course, that itself is a way of disincentivizing people to attend or think about UDC. So I think the unfortunate story is that UDC just isn't getting the attention that it needs and the support it needs, and there isn't a single policymaker who's currently championing what we can do to have a really strong public institution of higher education in DC. How do you get that change? Man, we'll have to strategize about that. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I do think, as I said in my opening remarks, there are 13 people on the DC Council. It doesn't take a lot to get attention. So it might be just trying to find that one person on the district who really sees the value of having a great higher education opportunity for DC students to go to when they graduate from high school, and then just sort of working from there. I think that's probably where I would start. There's a question up here.
In the district, the police force, not the officers, but the street level, what is the percentage that are Black, what are Hispanic, and I guess there may be some Asians?
So the question is, what percentage of the current DC police force is Black? And I don't know the answer. I mean, so my guess would be the same as yours from observing that there are a substantial number of officers of color, but also a substantial number who are white. Is there a question behind the question? That's it? Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer, but I do know that most don't live in the district.
Thank you, Ed, for doing this. I have a question about, I think I have a way to ask about the election and not asking.
All right.
So 2 parts. DC has a program called the Fair Elections Program, which
Yes.
you're familiar with, which is about spending limits and donor matching. And as someone who has run without the DC Fair Elections Program and through it, I wonder how you think it's working. And related to that, there have been a number of very well-funded independent expenditures this campaign, one by a group called Democrats for
Deeper,
Education
yeah.
Reform. Deeper,
Yeah.
there was a post article about it yesterday.
Yeah.
What are your view on that, and is it undermining the Fair Elections Program?
Thank you for those questions. So the Fair Elections Program is public financing. So since starting in 2020, candidates who chose to only take money from individuals, so no PAC, no corporate donations, and agreed to donations of small amounts. So if you're running for the DC Council in a particular ward, the maximum donation is $50, but it gets matched 5 to 1. So a $50 donation turns into $300 for someone who's using public financing in the District of Columbia. And I would say it's working really well. It certainly helped me when I ran, as you said, a race before and after. And it's a lot easier to ask people for $50 than it is to ask them for $1,500. Particularly when you can tell them that it will be matched. I was able to raise more money through public financing than I was without public financing. More broadly, it allows people who are new to politics and don't have a big Rolodex or a lot of deep-pocketed friends to raise money. It takes pressure off people seeking corporate donations. So it just has broadened our democracy. Some people say that it's greatly increased the number of people who run for office, and I don't actually think that's necessarily true. For example, this election cycle, there are 4 people running for the at-large seat in the Democratic primary. 4 years ago, it was 3 people. So I think it's working really well. I just think it strengthens our democracy if people can run races and be able to run a competitive campaign by only asking for small amounts from donors. In terms of the deferred, so thanks to the Supreme Court, independent expenditures on campaigns are allowable in unlimited amounts, and the district there's nothing it can do to stop it. The biggest investor in the district is Democrats for Education Reform, defer. I think simply put, there's actually an article in the Post, maybe even today, about them. A pro-charter organization where a lot of their money comes from conservative, out-of-state, like the Walton Foundation. So it's clearly not a grassroots funded within the district effort. And they pour hundreds of thousands of dollars into races. This year, I've gotten mailers from them primarily for Phil Mendelson and Eric Goulet in Ward 3. Yeah. So it's an unfortunate part of our system that there's nothing we can do about. I think the more we can just publicize that if you're getting those mailers, they're coming from an organization that isn't necessarily representative of the district. You may remember 2 years ago, they also invested heavily in the Ward 4 race that was won by Janice Lewis-George, where they mostly attacked her position for wanting to reform how we do policing. And it happened just as George Floyd was murdered by a police officer. So it backfired on them then. They issued an apology, but they are back in the game in very strong form this election season. Yeah, you have to look. Yeah.
Question via Zoom.
Is it unrealistic to think that the DC police force would ever be without guns?
I think that's a question that we can all answer. For me personally, knowing that in many countries, the public safety officials don't have guns, it seems like moving towards a situation where we have fewer guns in the arms of government officials who are enforcing the law is a good thing. We're also a gun-heavy country, so it's hard to imagine it happening. That's why I think the best approach is not one that necessarily takes arms away from police, but takes responsibilities away from police. So that if Philando Castile was murdered by a police officer in Minnesota for a traffic stop because he had, a light that wasn't, was out. If the person who had stopped him was not a police officer who didn't have a gun, Philando Castile would be alive today. So that's more where I would go is what can we do? What responsibilities can we shift away from police into people who are community-based and who have a function of harm reduction rather than law enforcement?
I would not want the job of doing traffic stops if I could not, well, I don't have a gun, I never would get one. But is there any law saying that people can't carry guns in their cars? What I'm trying to point out is that if you have unarmed people stopping people for legitimate traffic issues, some of the people in those cars are going to have guns. How do you transition so that everybody knows that the police and the enforcers of traffic are not police?
I'm sorry, what's the last part of your question?
If you have people who are not police.
Yeah.
And I understand and I support this, but it's hard for me to imagine somebody without a gun stopping someone for a traffic violation and not setting them up for being harmed by someone within the car who has a gun. Now that doesn't cover maybe even 85% of the people in cars.
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of these questions are a balance of like, what's the best outcome, knowing that there's not a perfect outcome. I mean, I would just say personally for myself, number one, police in DC are not allowed to be in high-speed chases. So if you imagine someone is an active criminal involved in something violent and has a gun and is ready to use it at that moment, they're probably speeding and the police aren't supposed to be chasing them anyway. And the safer thing probably to do is to let that person flee and catch them later than when they're speeding in a car and could crash into somebody or could shoot whoever tries to stop them, whether it's a police officer who's armed or somebody else. But I would just assume by and large, if you're stopping somebody because they were going 40 miles an hour in a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit or zone, or they were cutting people off, or they had a broken taillight, I wouldn't assume that those people have a gun or that they're going to use it because you stop them. That would just be I don't know, what the research shows, but I just can't imagine that there are that many people who are killed for stopping somebody for a nonviolent traffic offense.
I think it may be time for us to hear questions from our Zoomers. Sid,
Yes, we have a question from Liz.
talk into the mic, please.
Can you hear me now?
Face it right toward your mouth.
Yeah, it's a matter of manipulating this computer.
Can't
We
hear
have
it.
a question. We have a question from Liz asking about whether people who are being.
I'll repeat the question. It's working.
Whether people who are offered shelter by the city to come inside really want to be there.
Really want to be where?
In the indoor space.
Yes. So the question is, when people are offered shelter, do they want to be there? And it's a very, very complicated question, right? Because you can see some people not wanting to be in shelter for a variety of reasons, some of which you might say are not reasonable. You can also imagine a lot of people choosing not to be in shelter for reasons that are entirely reasonable. The fact that their own safety may be compromised, the fact that their things could get stolen, the fact that the shelter itself may not be sanitary. In DC, shelter conditions are improving, but they're not beautiful and amazing. There's some people who are just loners and want to be left alone. And so I think, I guess I would just say if someone is choosing, if someone's on the street in intent, that must mean that they believe that a shelter, they know shelters are available to them. The better approach, in my opinion, is to invest heavily in organizations like Pathways to Housing or Community of Hope or Friendship Place that have staff who go to build trust with people who are on the street. Go talk to them, build a relationship, and then offer them not shelter, but permanent affordable housing.
To be fair to Liz's question, which I could not see on the computer in its entirety, she began by asking what assistance is available to people who move from the street into housing.
Yeah.
Due to residents stay in their homes or perhaps. I think.
So what
you
question,
should
what-
answer that question.
What services are available? I mean, as I said in my remarks, the district has done a good job of funding its permanent supportive housing program. So for a lot of people who face chronic homelessness, who've been on the street for a long time and often have a coexisting problem, there are now housing opportunities. And the biggest challenge there is actually convincing some of them, if they particularly have a severe mental illness, that this housing is real and that they should move into it, particularly if they've been on the street for a long time and know what they've gotten used to. But for people who are not chronically homeless, they're more in and out of the homeless services system. There isn't a guarantee of affordable housing at the end of the road. There's a shelter, and again, those shelter conditions are not always ideal, and some people sometimes choose not to be in shelter. And of course, the more housing prices continue to rise, the more people who are just pushed into that temporary homelessness because they just can't afford their rent.
If we ask you, without stating any endorsements, and you discuss where the various candidates are on the various issues you discussed, especially the mayor candidates and the AG candidates.
On any particular, is there a specific issue? No, I think I probably will stay away from that. I would just encourage people to read the Washington Post did a candidate questionnaire. I'm not sure that was amazing. Legal Women Voters had one that I think was better. Jews United for Justice is a local nonprofit that organizes Jews to get involved in social justice issues. They endorsed in the Attorney General's race, they endorsed in Ward 3, they endorsed in Ward 1, they endorsed in the mayor's race. You could easily look up Jews United for Justice campaign fund and see who they endorsed and why, and that maybe would be one answer to those questions.
Any more questions here? Any more on the floor?
I have
Okay,
a question.
well, we want to thank you very much.
Wait, we have a Sid
Wait,
Booth question.
I have a question. It wasn't on your list, but as you sketch the history of racism in this country, and in particular here, it came to my mind that we have not talked about reparations. And I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so the question is thoughts on reparations. Another complicated question, but the bottom line is I support reparations, right? If we have a country that enslaved people, stole their labor, had them build the city, the institutions of the city, without being compensated, no 40 acres and a mule ever delivered. We have a country that after the end of slavery, relegated people to low-wage jobs, kept them out of the best schools, denied the New Deal programs to them, denied home ownership opportunities that built the middle class after World War II. I think if any of us went through all of that denial, we would say we're owed something, right? And then the question becomes, who's owed? Is it only people who have a history of being enslaved in the United States, which is what the leading reparations experts suggest? Or does it include anybody who's lived in this country for some amount of time who is Black, who also clearly suffered as a result of Jim Crow and all those federal and local policies that were racist? And then how much? I think it's a really important conversation to have. And I think at a minimum, just acknowledging that, that particularly Black people in this country wouldn't have an 81-to-1 wealth gap right now in this region if we didn't have racist public policy that had denied opportunity to them, suggests that we have a lot to do. And so if it's not reparations, perhaps it's also just directly investing in better education, creating home ownership opportunities, wealth building opportunities with a conscious mindset of we're actually doing this to undo the impacts of prior racism.